Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Night Games. This time we got a long one for you. It's Ring of Warmth, and it's good from now all the way through February the 28th, and it will get you 10% off orders of $10 or more at Noble Night Games. That's right, the code's going to last a long time, and it's a long code as well. It's Ring of Warmth to get you 10% off orders of $10 or more at Noble Night Games running through February the 28th. It's a perfect time to get more games after the holiday season, and if you haven't yet, why not check out Noble Knight's trade-in program? I just did it myself. It was super easy, and now I have room on my shelves to put more games. And when I buy those games, I want to buy them from Noble Night Games. I'm going to use the code Ring of Warmth, and it's running now through February 28th from our friends over at Noble Night Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. When I said, hey, Stu, have they ever made an RPG with Julian Sands? He said, Hambone, that's a different kind of warlock. Stu Horvath.
Very deep cut there. I love that movie. I love the second Warlock. The second Warlock is so good. The third one is not good, though.
I ended up in an elevator with him once. Julian Sands. I was at a convention, and the band I was in was playing, and I'm trying to no-sell this because I don't get like excited around famous people, but it's fucking Julian Sands. And he's sitting there. He's like, got a gig tonight, man? And I was like, yeah. He's like, rock and roll. And I was like, yeah. That was a hell of a night.
There's a dissolute Englishman in the beginning of the Masks of Nyarlathotep Peru chapter. And you know how I like to take pictures, find pictures of the NPCs to share with the players. I totally used an old Julian Sands for this 30-year-old guy. So like, because Julian Sands really has that energy. I think it comes from The Naked Lunch for me, really, of just like this kind of like debauched, like nobleman type fellow. And it was just a good look for this particular character. But the idea of using like old Julian Sands to pretend that he's 30 was very funny for the group. Like, well, that Julian Sands? Yeah.
You're like, you damn right it was. Well, I mean, in fairness, Warlock came out in 1989, right?
Wow. That 89, really? Jeez.
Yeah, 89. And I think it was maybe 2009 when I ran into him in that elevator. And let me tell you, Stu, hadn't aged a day. Like, I think he stopped aging in 1989, and that was it. Like, he hit, like, peak English gentleman and then just stopped aging. He's probably got a painting in his house that's covered in velvet that no one is actually able to look at. I don't know. I'm just making wild speculations here at this point, but had not aged.
Wouldn't be surprised if there was some actual black magic. 1989. I was 11 when I watched Warlock. That seems inappropriate.
Yeah, you were.
Anyway. Role-playing games, that's what we're here for.
Yeah, what's Warlock the RPG? If you haven't figured it out by now, folks, we're talking about an RPG called Warlock.
And it's Warlock with an exclamation point. I believe that's very important in signaling sort of the grand tradition that this comes out of. So I have the 2021 Black Edition, which was a joint venture between Fire Ruby Designs and Black Oath. This is sort of an attempt to OSR the British fantasy role-playing games, which there's really just two major ones that go back that far, and that's Advanced Fighting Fantasy and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. They sort of sit on two different ends of the spectrum, right? Like Advanced Fighting Fantasy is basically Troika, very light system used initially to power game books, but then sort of spun off into its own series of role-playing supplements, which kind of famously all of the rule books have the exclamation point. Dungeoneer is the first one, and it's Dungeoneer. It's not just Dungeoneer.
I mean, let's get enthusiastic about RPGs, right? Nothing says enthusiasm like exclamation points. Honestly, like, we are in the generation where texting has become so prevalent that, like, you can't really ever tell tone by a text. But when you put an exclamation point, it infers excitement or like energy of some kind. So yeah, man, stop an exclamation point on there. Let's get wild.
I type exclamation points a lot, but I feel like I rarely sound like I'm exclaiming in real life. Understand it in person, folks. And then Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is sort of like the other end of the spectrum. It's a lot more complicated. It drew us from RuneQuest and Dungeons and Dragons and Call of Cthulhu, and kind of is a much heavier rule set. Warlock kind of aims to be right in the middle, verging towards the more streamlined. But the idea is that the rule set doesn't matter so much as embracing this aesthetic of that Russ Nicholson-led grim and gritty take that British fantasy established in the early 80s. And I think it does a really good job of this. So one of the things that I've learned in buying basically every role-playing game that I see is that you wind up building like this tool chest that you always have like the thing that you need. I don't recommend most people do this, but it's nice because I love the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay campaign Enemy Within. I think it's just brilliant. The first 3 parts are great. And now Cubicle 7 is putting out a sort of remastered, expanded version that corrects the final 2 parts, which were not great back in the day. And I really love it. And I kind of want to play it in Warhammer Fantasy First Edition, and that would be okay. I mean, ideally, I was hoping that Cubicle 7 4th edition would be like kind of like modernized Call of Cthulhu 7th edition, where it's like you have that old school core with like the modern candy coating. That's not really the case. It's too complicated a system. So I'm like, how am I going to run this thing? Like, I don't want to have like a crazy miniature tactical, like all these rules. I just like there's tokens and meta currencies, and how do I do it? And then I was just like, well, I have this Warlock thing, and I think that I could actually run something so complicated as Enemy Within with this. I think that it's a deceptively simple system in that it's easy to grok, but it has really deep application. Like, I'm pretty sure that I could use this to run a complicated, heavy rule set replacement Enemy Within. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that the game exists because Greg Saunders, the author, wanted exactly that. I've been told that he was struggling with the same thing. He wants to run Enemy Within, but doesn't want to like deal with that old robust system. So he kind of streamlined it and took the OSR hack approach to making something that looks and feels like the experience that you want, but is actually a little bit easier to handle.
I think that's important in modern RPGs. Now, there's nothing wrong with the system that you're playing, dear listener. If you love it, no matter how crunchy it is, if you're happy, I'm happy for you. I'm excited for you. And that being said, I know when a lot of people come to RPGs for the first time, there is a massive barrier to entry for people. It's a big hurdle to get over when you have a lot of rules and a lot of things and a lot of moving parts, instead of just being able to come to the table, roll your clicky clacky math rocks, and like use your imagination, which is really, in essence, the most important thing about RPGs, right? The ability to get out there and use your imagination. So, I mean, I'm looking at the character sheet for this, and I can imagine why the OG Warhammer fantasy role-playing would be overwhelming to people who just really want to have that like all killer, no filler experience playing these games. And I'm on blackoathgames.com, and I'm looking at a picture of the character sheet. This thing looks great. It's 1 page.
Yeah.
It is easy. You got stamina, you got luck, you got pluck, you got your adventuring skills, and pretty much walking into something like this, you're like, hey, roll above this number, roll under this number, whatever it needs to be for this particular system. Bob's your uncle.
Yeah, it's a skill-based system, so it's percentiles for most, and it's not a huge skill list. It keeps it manageable. It's career-based instead of class and level, which is pure Warhammer. Yeah, there's 3 attributes. It delivers the same basic, experience, but it just takes out everything that you don't necessarily need that can be distracting. All those things are good, but like, I think that the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is a fantastic system all the way through. It has its flaws, but like, it's not like a killer system. Like, I think that RuneQuest is a more difficult system than Warhammer. But that said, like, especially now when like the likelihood of me running Enemy Within at a table in person, it's low. And I don't want to play something like Warhammer Fantasy 4 digitally. It's easier for me to play on a virtual tabletop with a slimmer game. Don't get me wrong. Simpler doesn't necessarily mean easy. It's still a role-playing game. Black Hack and OSE are the same way. It's like they simplify, but they're not necessarily easy games to pick up. It's like a reduction in cooking, right? Like, that's an easy thing to do, but it's also really super easy to screw up if you don't know what you're doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, we talk about this a lot on the show. Rules light, which is essentially what Warlock is touted as, doesn't mean dumbed down. It means that we've streamlined this so it's easier to absorb for the reader.
Yeah.
Because when you say rules light, people often gravitate towards 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons because that's what they're selling it as. Well, it's rules light. It's not as heavy, but yet every one of those books is textbook length, and you can't be considered rules light if you've got over 100 pages in your rule book, you know?
People feel that way. But 5th edition is good for beginners too, like in a way that maybe Warlock isn't. Still stands by some of those old school things that you kind of have to like get a feel for, I think, in a way that you don't necessarily with 5th edition. 5th edition, it's like fantasy themed Disney rides where you're on tracks and like everything's sort of carefully curated for you to kind of walk through these experiences. Whereas, you know, the older school games, by being more open to player choice, necessarily require sort of like rules that are harder to grasp because they facilitate sort of a wider spectrum of play. Again, not calling balls and strikes or saying, you know, one is better than the other. It's just different design approaches. But, you know, whatever. Warlock is great. It really nails the vibe of the period. Carlos Castillo does some fantastic artwork inside. Nobody's ever going to touch Russ Nicholson at his height, as far as I'm concerned. But Carlos does a pretty good job. It doesn't like try to imitate that. He gets at the same thing in his own way, which is really important to me because, you know, you don't want just like a knockoff imitation. His own style comes through. There's information on sort of like a world that you could play in if you like. That's not really what I'm coming to Warlock for, but the world is interesting and hits those old world kind of notes or Titan fighting fantasy world. They have a very specific vibe. Again, grim, gritty, sort of late medieval, early Renaissance kind of tech level. Everything's sort of horrible, but you could also see why like people kind of like it. There's things that appeal to the setting that even though it's horrible, you kind of want to check it out and live there, maybe. So another cool thing about Warlock, this ties into the world, I guess, is the races. So you have humans, of course, but you also have your classic semi-human races. You got elves, dwarves, halflings, but none of these things are quantified as race. They are called communities, and being one does not impart any kind of mechanical advantage to your character.
I like that.
Right? You get social advantages because, you know, communities have different views of other types of communities. City folks are a little bit different than country folks. And there should be some sort of way to, you know, kind of like simulate that in the game. But without mechanics, there's no bonuses. Like, so there's an even playing field for all your communities. I think that's a really good design choice. I've been told by one of the folks that frequents our Discord is in the Warlock Discord and told me that it's really amusing how many people are kind of like, well, this is how we could fix that so that you could have modifiers and make it mechanical. And like other people in the community are like, this is a choice that was made so that we don't want to do that. Like, it's better this way.
Yeah, you're kind of barking up the wrong tree there, bud.
Yeah.
And I love this idea. Like, this is, to me, the most elegant way to deal with something like this.
Yeah, like when we played Witchburner, is the other way. Like you have like a set of like just physical genetics that like you're a big strong guy and you use like the half orc thing to kind of give you those bonuses to reflect that. Or, you know, you're a little guy who's like nimble, so you use the gnome stuff or the halfling stuff, right? But you're not actually like a different race because that's weird, you know? But this approach kind of takes it in a way where you preserve the idea of there being sort of different types of communities. It's still there, sort of. Making it mechanical makes it very weird to me, just because it's saying that there's like real differences when we know that there aren't. I just don't like it. I think that this is a good way of working around it while preserving some of the idea of different magical attributes for each community. So I just think that it strikes a balance between giving you a variety of choice without being like making it weird or muddy. And I think because it pushes the idea of societal differences, benefits and hindrances, which humans don't have. That's their one benefit, really, is that there is no real hindrance or benefit to being human. In that, it puts sort of an emphasis on role play in a way that I find appealing. You know, community there's a certain amount of implied behavior that's attached to that, right? And that gives you like options for how to play and informs the world because, communities are formed by where they are. Like literally people who are near a river tend to become like fishermen and boaters, and that has an impact on how the community functions. So it takes like this weird sort of abstraction of like existence, and it actually like breaks it all down and grounds it in the world in a way that I think is like super cool and positive.
That's awesome, man. It's always fun to see when people take a perceived issue in something like an RPG and find a way to tweak it in a way where it's clever and applicable at the same time. That's awesome. That's kind of refreshing when people can figure out a way to solve a problem in a very cool and fun way.
It is technically a percentile, but when I say percentile, people think, oh, D100. It's not a D100, it's a D20. But like it's graded to be, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
When you roll a D20, it's still a percentile. This is like math stuff that I'm not really good at. It's just the bell curve for the odds is different.
Yeah, I think really what it comes down to is this. When people think of Dungeons and Dragons, the grand sprawling idea of what an RPG is Dungeons and Dragons, the dice that they completely identify Dungeons and Dragons with is the D20.
Yeah.
And I think that when you take a person who is coming to the hobby for the first time and you're trying to sit them down and get them to play a game that is an RPG, but doesn't involve a D20, which is the thing that they've like seen pictures of all the time. The thing like the D20 essentially is like the Nike swoosh or like the Apple logo. Like that is what Dungeons and Dragons is. And you're going to come and play a fantasy role-playing game and you're not going to use a D20. And I think that in a lot of ways is a stumbling block for the generic role-playing system because it's a D100 system, right?
Yeah.
Where it's still all percentile. It's like the same math, just a different kind of equation. But because it's not that D20, it's a harder sell to many new people joining the hobby. Whereas something like this, cool, man. Just give them the fucking D20. All they want is to be able to like take that photo with the D20 and it's easily identifiable and people know that they're playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. And it's simpler. It's one die. It's less that you have to manage. It is basically a roll over 20. You take your skill points, your value of your skill, you roll a D20 and hope to beat a 20. It's very simple. Combat is opposed. It reminds me a lot of the Black Hack in terms of the way sort of these recognizable systems have been taken apart with all the pieces laid out and reassembled in kind of ways that are new and exciting and easier to handle. I've never rebuilt a transmission, but like imagine you take apart the transmission and there's all these pieces. And then you've been putting it back. You're just like, well, we didn't actually need half of these pieces. And now we have a more streamlined transmission. That sounds probably like an impossibility. I'm sure that mechanically a car needs all of those parts. But metaphorically, that's what I'm trying to get across here. Everything feels the same. Everything feels recognizable. But there's a heft that is not there. And that lack of heft, it feels sort of like a fun kind of new energy into the game. I think it's great. If I do run Enemy Within, I'm totally going to do it with Warlock. And I think it will hold up just fine.
I'm sure it will. Studio, any final thoughts on Warlock? Exclamation point.
Exclamation point. I think it's great. Like I said, if you're looking for this specific thing, if you're looking for the British fantasy role-playing experience from the 80s, and you want to play, something like Enemy Within or older material like that with that flavor, this is the perfect thing to do it without getting bogged down in older systems. Those older systems are also expensive. It's not easy to get, original editions of Advanced Fighting Fantasy or the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Like that's a $60 book, which, has a crappy spine and is going to fall apart on you. Like this is a very nice book. It's small, it's digest sized, and it's not going to fall apart. And it's an easier system to learn, pick up, and kind of get to the table. You don't need miniatures. It's the modern kind of take on those things. So if that's what you desire, Warlock provide.
Very cool, man. Well, this was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG. I do have posts about Warlock and some other indie games coming in March. So look out for that.
Very cool. And you are listening to this in the year of whatever date you subscribe to or don't. 2022. So Stu's on his 2022 post. He's already got posts done until 2023. So get psyched because we've got a lot of cool stuff coming on the Instagram. You can find me on the Twitter, on Instagram, and on TikTok from time to time at John McGuire RPG. I'm posting more. I have things to promote. If you want to check out my RPG 3-2-1 Action Presents Rocket to Russia, just boogie on down to Exalted Funeral. You were going shopping there anyway. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. You really like the show, why not become a patron? Patreon.com/vintagerepg. I know Stu and I have been talking for a while that we're going to reshape the Patreon a little bit, and we are getting there. We're coming to some final decisions on that. We got a lot of cool things coming in the new year. We've still got a killer Discord community we'd love for you to be a part of. We've got early release episodes. We've got a behind-the-scenes look at my RPG 3-2-1 Action. We've got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points, and so much more. Patreon.com/vintagerepg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dego West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.